White. Greetings, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Indigenous Resistance to the MountPolley Disaster. I'll be moderating this. My name is Kanahus Manuel. I'm from the Secwepemc Nation. I'm coming to you live from Kamloops, Secwepemc territory, in the heart of our territory. This is the 44th day since the Imperial Metals MountPolley disaster, and we are glad to come and join here live to share our stories and bring a humanness to this catastrophe. We have an all-women's panel today, and it's two very powerful, strong women. We have Secwepemc Elder Jean William. She is a Secwepemc Elder and Secwepemc language teacher. She's fluent in her language. She was born and raised in Tlachas. She is an expert of her Secwepemc culture and has extensive knowledge and is a knowledge keeper. She has extensive knowledge on the cultural, spiritual, and historical significance of the area, the area that has been impacted by the MountPolley disaster. And we also have with us Joan Kuyek. She is a strategist, researcher, and educator living in Ottawa. She was the founding national coordinator of MiningWatch Canada from 1999 to 2009. She also teaches mining law policy and communities at Queen's University Law School, community development and social change at Carleton University, and mines and communities in a program, IdleNoMore University Spring Institute. So I'd like to welcome this all-woman panel. For those that might not be completely aware of what the MountPolley tailings disaster was, it was a big mine catastrophe that happened on August 4th of this year. It dumped 10 billion liters of contaminated tailing liquids into our watershed, into our clean water, and 5 billion liters of tailing sludge. It's actually 70% larger than they had originally had estimated. Here in Secwepemc Nation, and we come from a vast territory in so-called British Columbia, Canada. We have around 10,000 Secwepemc people that are part of our nation. And I'd like to start off with asking our Secwepemc Elder Jean William to introduce herself and give the cultural, spiritual, and historical significance of this area that has been impacted. Jean William.
Yep. Jean William and Squaxt, the Tlachal Kun. Anyway, and Mem, match them Williams Lake Indian Band. Jalchama O East Nui, Tonaway, Cacao, to match them to Squilqueld Oi, as Squilqueld. It's match sweet, the Ewald. When I come go. The Secwepemc Chim stem the Wanachum Yui the Tamil. Good evening, my name's Jean William and I'm from the Williams Lake Indian Band. Our traditional name is Tlachal. Our ancestral name is Chakchichan. We have a lot of respect for what we call Squilqualdaui, the real snow mountains out in the Cornell Lake area. The areas around the likely area and where the spill has been, the devastation of the spill in that likely area and the Polley Lake area. This is one of the most magnificent areas of our territory. This territory, in my mind, is the heart of our nation here at Tlachal in the Williams Lake area. It's a paradise to us, and it's a paradise to all of our elders. When you take a look at a lot of the sacred places that are out there, it reminds us, and it reminds me of the stories that I heard from our people. This area really needs to be protected because our elders say we need to appreciate and always respect this area. The name that was given to the area closest to the spill is called Sen Yucht ne Senchaimetkwa. Yucht means that's where our salmon are born. Sen means the greatest. I'll just kind of use the Great Lakes as a whatever, and but because it means it's a big, and then Chaimetkwa means a big lake and water. The Canal Lake area is a sacred area for our people. We have villages, too numerous to count, where the smallpox epidemic took place. It wiped out all of our Secwepemc people in that area. There are sacred protocols that our people and anyone going into the sacred mountains should be aware of. These practices were not practiced by our visitors, but are still practiced today, and that's why we have so much respect. These are pristine areas. Our elders say in their stories that the water is so crystal clear that you could see to the bottom of the rivers that flow. These waters, to us, were so sacred that we were able to use it as medicine. Medicines that we use in our sweat lodges. Water is one of our sacred elements of matter. There are 4 sacred elements, and water is one that I think is so unique in this. I want to talk a bit about not only the pit houses that are out in that area, and there's so much of the archaeology stuff. I want to talk a bit about endangered species out there. The mountain caribou is red listed. Why we call this area in our minds the heart of the snow mountains, and that should be treated with with dignity and respect. We have so many animals, not only the endangered mountain caribou, but also the grizzly. We have so many 4-legged animals, not to mention the salmon. We have also the bull trout. We have so many other species of fish in the area. The connection that our people have to this area is so important that we always need to remember that these people, our ancestors, told us many stories, and we should follow these protocols that when we go out in these waters, that we have our ceremonies. Our ceremonies include that we must bathe in this water in Senchaimetkwa. We bathe in the morning. We bathe in the evening. And then we sing songs, our sacred songs. And then we have prayer. Along with our prayer in this ceremony, we also have songs and we dance. And these are still practiced today. We are trying to pass this to all of our youth. We also always have to remember that we have to give back not only to the land, but also to the water. To show respect, to always follow these protocols. I've worked with elders from the time I was a child, and I took it more interest in it in the 1970s, where I heard and listened to many of the stories. In 1996, I began to do extensive studies in the Canal Lake area. I was fortunate to get stories from elders who lived to be over 100 years old and over 90 years old. These areas, the area of Canal Lake and Senchai-Metqua, means a lot to us. That what happens to our salmon, what happens to our water, if we are not able to use that water, if our salmon has been infected by all of this chemicals that are in there, it's going to be devastating to our nation. Going to be devastating to our identity. How are we going to pass on our culture and our knowledge to our young people? This is what we are calling honoring our connection to the land and honoring the stories of our ancestors. I'm not sure if I covered everything. I can leave it up to questions.
Okay, thank you, Jean. Thank you for sharing all that information, and I just wanted to tell everybody that I have a candle here. It's lit. It's our fire. It's the fire that we brought from there. It's the fire that we keep burning in the hearts of everybody. I also brought with me some water that some likely residents had got from Quesnel Lake. She got it right off the shores. As you could tell, it's cloudy. It's important to note right now that the province of British Columbia has lifted the ban and for drinking water, and they're telling the people of Likely and the surrounding area that it's all right to drink the water right now. But as you could tell, it's cloudy. They said that unless it's cloudy or smelly, don't drink it. So you could tell that it's cloudy to this point. This area that Jean was talking about is very important too. I'd like to add that it's the only inland temperate rainforest in the world. It comes from a very special place, and that this area, it's home to salmon spawning beds. And Indigenous people of British Columbia everywhere depends on salmon for their food, for our survival food. It was given to us so we wouldn't starve, so we'd be able to survive into the future. Going back to the day of August 4th, on the day of the MountPolley disaster, I I was traveling out in Mohawk territory at the time, and when I got word, I ended up being in Toronto, and we did an emergency rally in front of the Toronto Stock Exchange to bring attention to Imperial Metals disaster and how it impacts everybody, how to bring attention to the financial center of Toronto and all these mining companies that, you know, are held in the Toronto Stock Exchange. We need to address all mining. And so after I returned home, we were having a Secwepemc gathering. It was a very important gathering for our nation, and it was hosted by our community of Nisconlith. But during that gathering, there were some important meetings discussed of territorial authority, jurisdiction, land title issues, and it was the elders and the women and the youth that brought the main concern as being the MountPolley disaster, and that we need to do something because our people are crying. And so that's when our people had said to light a sacred fire, to go to that area and light a sacred fire so we may be able to have prayers, so our people would be able to grieve, so our people would be able to get to the bottom of what was really happening out there, eyewitness accounts, and actually survey the damage. And we lit that fire 14 days after the spill. On August 18th we went, and it was through the hereditary chiefs that had joined us up there from our area, and the salmon chief from the Secwepemc Okanagan Confederacy that made it clear to the women that it was for the women to start the fire, that we are the life givers, and we are the ones that birth children to bring into this nation, to raise this nation. So we lit that fire, and from the very beginning of the day that we were there on site, at the entrance to the MountPolley site, we began to have all the likely residents come by, give their testimonies, ex-employees and whistleblowers come to the fire and voice their concerns, even current day employees and contractors coming to the fire to tell us about the catastrophe and how there was no cleanup taking place. And so from being there, we were able to survey the damage. And on that day of August 4th, just to give you an idea of what happened on that day, was that when the dam breached, the tailings impoundment area is around the size of Stanley Park, for those that you know, is around 4 kilometers wide, 3 telephone poles high, full of toxic tailings, sediment, and sludge. So when this dam breached and it collapsed, and all of that went into Polley Lake, and Polley Lake is a glacier lake, it's a clean lake, and from Polley Lake it blasted down into Hazeltine Creek, which is 10-kilometer wide creek, or 10-kilometer long creek. It was around 5 feet wide. Just a small creek. Some people said at some points they could just jump over the creek. And so it was like a small creek. You could see it. You cannot see it from a satellite image prior to the spill. What happened was when this power of this tailings came blasting down, it tore a whole 150 feet, 200 foot wide gorge and canyons, and changed the landscape forever. It actually uprooted giant cedars and giant firs, old growth. This is the inland temperate rainforest, like old growth cedars, tore them right off, tore the bark right off. Now there's debris lying everywhere. Everything is covered with sludge, toxic sludge and sediment. Going over onto the site on the day that we went, there's moose tracks and grizzly bear tracks and cougar tracks. All of those are impressions in that sludge and sediment, not being able to cross what once was Hazeltine Creek. So the amount of devastation is so massive. After it exited out of the Hazeltine Creek, it flew into Quesnel Lake, and Quesnel Lake is the deepest fjord lake in the world. It's a glacier-fed lake. It's beautiful. You saw the pictures when Jean was talking. It's just crystal clear. And these are salmon lakes. This is where the salmon spend their year getting big. And so when this blasted through into Quesnel Lake, they were originally thinking that sediment was going to settle to the bottom of the lake, but it's so big, there's researchers on that lake even prior to the spill that couldn't understand the ebb and flow of the lake, the back eddies, the way that it moved, that the sediment didn't settle. There was sediment plumes coming up all over the lake, everywhere, and then moved from Quesnel Lake to Quesnel River and into the Fraser River. And the Fraser River watershed is 63% of the province of BC depends on that Fraser River. That's like over half of the British Columbia population. This needs to be a public outcry. This is a wake-up call to everybody that our water and our salmon are at great risk. And if we're allowing province and industry to come into our territories and destroy this and showing their negligence and not doing anything for cleanup. So the whole time we were there for 14 weeks, there was no cleanup. They said a part of their plan was to do an assessment first. So a part of their assessment was getting the sampling and the test done, but they said they couldn't get the proper sampling from Polley Lake because at Polley Lake, where it first entered in, so much debris came in and it made a dam. It made a dam into Hazeltine Creek, which they were calling a plug. And they were saying it was too dangerous to either go on Polley Lake or go down below the dam, the plug, to Hazeltine Creek to get the sediment. So the proper testing hasn't been done, and we're feeling that the province and Imperial Metals are being very slow and negligent in hiding the fact that there are massive amounts of toxics in the tailings impoundment area. So after talking to many different scientists that had come to the camp and many other scientists that we're coming in contact with, we were able to talk to some Japanese doctors that were coming over to Grassy Narrows to test on the Minamoto disease. And this is a mercury poisoning that has been affecting the Anishinaabe, and they've been researching and testing it since the 70s. What I had told them that during the past 4 years, and this mine's been open since '97, but during the past 4 years, 2.6 tons of mercury were in that tailings pond. And I told them that the province had lifted the ban, the drinking water ban, and they were saying it was all right for the people to drink. And they said, no, do not drink the water for up to 100 kilometers. And this was very serious. And they were wondering and confused as to why the province was being so lenient on that. I'd like to just make note too that Quesnel River is the world's second largest salmon run, and that salmon to our people is sacred. Our connection to our salmon, as we could see even from the sacred fire that we had lit at the entrance to the resort, that there was Indigenous people coming from the Chilcotin territory concerned about the salmon, the Stadtlium territory concerned about the salmon. There was Alaska fishermen and fishermen unions from Alaska contacting us, worried about the salmon, all the way down to Nia Bay in Washington State, worried and concerned about the salmon. This is something that links Indigenous people, and that's why we say that industry is a direct attack on our very existence as Indigenous people, because by eliminating our food is like eliminating the buffalo for the Lakota. It's the same as eliminating the salmon for the Secwepemc people here. And salmon is sacred. Salmon is so in our DNA, as I heard marine biologists say, that the DNA of salmon are in the leaves. Well, this DNA of the salmon are in our blood as Indigenous people as well. So I've attended many of the likely meetings with community members and also at the community hall, and Likely is the closest settler town on Quesnel Lake. They currently have no drinking water. We have made friends and family and relatives with many people in Likely, and that there's the only water that they're offering was some that was tested for arsenic. So there's a very concern that on their behalf too, that the Premier has never stepped in to offer clean water for the town. The Prime Minister, this should be a federal national environmental disaster. There needs to be attention put on this, that international human rights violations of not having clean, adequate, and healthy, safe drinking water for families and children living in the likely area. So there's like many other things that I could talk about, but some of the things that I wanted to talk about too are the people that were came to the fire, the people that expressed their concerns, the people that cried while we had the sacred fire put up, and some of them are workers. One of them came, he said that he touched the blue film that was on the water, some toxic chemical from the spill, and he got burnt. He brought it out at a likely town hall meeting, and he was fired by MountPolley Imperial Metals the day after. These are some of the issues that employees are coming to us. Also, after this spill, the Tahltan set up a blockade, blockading Imperial Metals' Red Chris mine, northern part of so-called British Columbia. And they blockaded, and they're going to continue to blockade and stop Red Chris from going through. They're going to need tons of support, tons of people support, manpower, fundraising in order to keep this blockade going, especially through the winter. This is around 900 kilometers north of present-day Prince George, and this area is beautiful as well, of the Tahltan territory. It is beautiful. It is the headwaters to 3 major rivers in BC, the Stikine, the Nass, and the Skeena, all salmon-bearing rivers. Also, the Secwepemc in the southern part of the territory are opposed and have been fighting Imperial Metals' Ruddock Creek project since hunters came across it many years ago. They're in the advanced exploration stage. If MountPolley shows that this is the way that they're going to deal with a catastrophe of this magnitude, that they cannot actually physically clean it up, they don't have the money to physically clean it up, that this puts a precedent on how they're going to deal with mining all throughout Indigenous territories. We cannot afford another MountPolley disaster to happen anywhere else within our territory of Secwepemc. Our water is too precious. This is already one major watershed that we have to work hard as Indigenous grassroots on how we're going to clean up and put pressure on the province to put fines and jail time, and these people are criminals. Imperial Metals are criminals, and the province is an accomplice by allowing this to continue to take place. So I'd like to just give the mic over to Joan. She's so she can speak some more. Again, we have questions. You could pose your questions right to the YouTube link, to the Facebook. We're going to be answering questions after. So right now, Joan Kuyek. Joan.
Am I on there?
Yeah.
Am I on?
Yes.
I have the. I'm really honored to be asked to be on this call and to share what little knowledge I have of how the mining industry works with you. The MountPolley's disaster is a disaster that was waiting to happen in British Columbia and all across this country. And then the time I spent working at MiningWatch, and before that I lived for 30 years in Sudbury, which is the largest mining community in the country. And it makes you realize just how systemic the problems with mining are, and how the destruction that's created by our love of metals is wrecked on the landscape and on the people who live there, has distorted and ruined lives. So this slide you're looking at is a picture of operating and selected exploration sites in BC, and all those little dots include the 20 operating mines and all the exploration sites that are trying to become mines. There's many of them. And so we'll look at some of the issues. There's 3 things I want to bring to your attention. The first one is that mining is really all about the management of waste. For the people who get the metals out and own the companies, it's about making profits. But for everything else, it's all about the management of waste. Mining's short term. Mines don't last very long, 10, 15 years max, and then they want to build another one. And the industry has captured the legislators and the policymakers in this province and in other places in Canada in a way that means that the citizens and the people who live here have very little control over what they do. Next slide. Mining's a waste management industry with toxic contamination that's going to have to be managed forever. Mining produces, can we go to the next slide? Mining produces enormous amounts of waste. If you look at what happens with gold, a wedding ring is less than 2 grams in weight. There's 1 million grams in a metric ton. And most gold that comes from porphyry mines like MountPolley and Gibraltar is less than 1 gram per ton. So if you think about it, in MountPolley, there's 0.303 grams per ton. So to get at this little bit, this tiny little bit of gold, what happens is that the rock is smashed up into millions of pieces, and the stuff that's left over, now exposed finer than sand, like face powder, and mixed with water and reagents and all sorts of stuff, is going to be left in a tailings impoundment forever. In fact, when you add all the reagents, the chemicals they put in, and the explosives and the other things, over 100% of the rock that's been mined is going to be left behind as waste rock and tailings. So it's all about managing this waste. You're going to get a 1.303 grams per ton. You can't even see it, it's so small, out of a ton of rock. And a ton of rock is huge. So you can imagine why you've got this problem. Now copper, there'll be a little bit more, there'll be a little bit more with nickel, there'll be more with lead and zinc. They're bigger amounts, but there's still a fraction, a tiny fraction of the amount of rock that has to be removed to get at them. We go to the next slide. A mine is huge, and even without a tailings spill, they're an enormous destruction of the landscape. If you look at MountPolley before the spill, and MountPolley isn't the biggest mine in BC. Gibraltar, which isn't very far away, is bigger than MountPolley. You have waste rock piles, you have the pits, you have the tailings impoundment, you have transmission lines and roads and all sorts of other things that go with the mine. There's the mill that crushes all this up, and there's a huge consumption of power. So the footprint of a mine, 25 square kilometers in size, and that's without the spill. The only difference between a spill and a mine is that the tailings are enclosed by a dam, so that they are at least controlled somewhat. But they've already destroyed all that land and used all that water. Next slide. Tailings impoundments. There's 98 tailings facilities in British Columbia at 60 operating and closed mines. Between 2000 and 2009, there were 49 dangerous and unusual occurrences at those mines. That's the language from the Ministry of Mines. And just a few of the spills that have happened, even in the last 10 years, there was the Obed Mountain mine spill, a coal spill in Alberta, huge problems. There was the Salmo mine spill in 2012. That was an abandoned mine that started to slump and seep. In Quebec, there was the Opimiska tailings spill, which happened on Cree territory. Another spill in BC at the Similco mine in 2007, and a big spill of mercury at the Pinchy Lake closed mine that was owned by Tekcominco in 2004. That was on Karisakani territory. So if you think about it, I mean, these are just a few of the things that have happened in Canada over that time. There have been many, many more leaks and seepages and plumes that come out of these tailings impoundments. According to a number of mining engineers, there isn't a tailings impoundment that doesn't leak. They all seep out underneath, and a lot of them have big plumes in the groundwater underneath them of toxic chemicals. Some of them are more toxic than others. Some of them have very high amounts of cyanide because it's used in the processing. Some of them have tons of arsenic because it's been used in the processing. A lot of them have mercury, selenium, and high levels of copper and nickel. The Highland Valley Tailings Storage Facility is one of the biggest ones. It's not that far from MountPolley either. And if you look at the data for it, look at that dam. That's just an enormous dam. And we put our faith in these companies to maintain those forever. Next slide. Next slide. Oops, back one. A mine is a short-term project with a very long-term environmental effects. When they're negotiating with First Nations and others about jobs, we're really talking about 10 to 15 years of employment. MountPolley's closed down for low commodity prices at one time. Gibraltar closed down at one point. MountPolley will now be closed for a very long time while they figure out what to do. So you're talking about 10 to 15 years, probably most, of benefits before you're having to live with this mess forever. Next slide. And then when they close the mine, this is about what it looks like. This is a reclaimed tailings dike, a dam, with a lake behind it that they occasionally stock with fish. You can't allow trees to grow on it because they will provide their roots will provide a source for water to damage the tailings dam. In most cases, we expect future generations to be able to look after these for us, and it's a legacy that I don't think any of us want to leave to our children. Can we go to the next slide? Generally, what happens when the mine starts being economic is a lot of mining companies walk away, and the mine becomes abandoned or orphaned. There's over 10,000 of these orphaned and abandoned mines in Canada. A number of them are in British Columbia. The Auditor General of Canada estimated that it would cost $7.7 billion just to clean up 15,000 contaminated sites in federal jurisdiction. That's only the ones that the federal government owns. Most of these are mines or nuclear waste sites. The worst of them all is the giant mine, which is pictured here in Yellowknife, which got the gold out by roasting the arsenopyrite ores and ended up with a byproduct of arsenic trioxide, which is now stored underground in 237,000 tons of it in the old shafts and drifts. And they can't clean it up. One of the things that you find out when you spend a lot of time looking at abandoned mines is that, in effect, we can't fix these contaminated sites. We don't know what to do with them. We can contain them. When we contain them, we then doom young people in perpetuity forever to look after them. We expect those young people to be able to monitor them, to make sure that they don't start leaking. And if they do, in many cases, we actually don't know what to do. And one of the reasons there's such a delay when there's an emergency and a disaster like MountPolley is, in fact, the company may have an emergency plan to deal with something like that, but they don't really know what it's going to be or how it's going to work or what's going to happen. And if you start cleaning it up wrong, you can make a worse mess. And so there's a lot of stumbling around and a lot of problems that just keep getting worse the whole time that's going on. And when you look at abandoned mines, that becomes abundantly clear. Maybe go to the next slide. I want to say that in BC and in most of Canada, in fact, the mining and the oil and gas companies make the law. And there's always a fight with the federal government or the provincial government over what that law is going to be, and our ability to influence what that law is and to get laws that support us has been diminished greatly over the last few years. So the companies enjoy two things. They enjoy impunity, which is the ability to ignore the law, So that a company like Imperial can get 5 notices from the government that their tailings impoundment is not going to be able to hold the increased water in it, and they can ignore it. And the kind of enforcement that happens isn't very punitive for companies. It's never, the government gets stuck because, quite frankly, if they put the company out of business, then there's still the mess to clean up. But the company has never got enough money to fix it. None of the reclamation bonds are ever big enough to fix it. At Giant, there was less than $1 million, and it's going to cost $1 billion to fix it. At MountPolley, the company has $15 million in environmental insurance and liability insurance, and it's unlikely that that will be anywhere near enough. That's why they've had to float another share offering. But in their own literature, they say that money that they're raising is also going to go to pay some of the capital costs for Red Chris and the Northwest Transmission Line. So they're expecting to do this for a very small amount of money, and I think that's totally unrealistic. The other thing that they have is that they can change the laws to suit what they want. And in BC, the mining lobby has been incredibly strong and effective. So they have environmental, health, and labor regulations that suit them pretty well. Internationally, they have stabilization clauses that allow their contracts to stand over and above changes in environmental law. And if we could just go to the next slide, they also control the tax rate. And in 2013, there was a study published by a man named Chen and Jack Mintz, who's one of the more conservative economists in the country, who found that mining companies, in fact, paid very little taxes. And in British Columbia, the actual tax rate, the one they really paid, was -9% for the base case. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't pay taxes once in a while when the prices are high and they're in high production. But generally speaking, the taxes they're paying don't exist. The government ends up owing them money. So if you only consider the mining tax, which is the royalty, the money they supposedly pay for the use of the metals, the marginal effective tax rate is -21.1%. So when people are trying to analyze why this government supports mining, it's not because the government gets a lot out of it. What happens is that the mining industry gets a lot out of it. We go to the next slide. And I just wanted to end what I was saying, this horribly depressing story about how the mining industry works, by saying that it is really, in my mind, a question of respect. And if we understood the awesome full cost of the minerals we take out of the ground, the cost in human lives, the cost to the salmon, the cost to the forests, we would treat them very, very differently. We'd recycle them, we'd conserve them, we'd reuse them, we'd try and heal the sacrifice zones that are there. We'd train intergenerational guardians to make sure that future generations weren't going to be saddled by these terrible toxic sites. And we'd really make sure that we put all our money and energy into healing these places that we've already destroyed. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Joan. I'd just like to also mention again, am I unmuted? That the Ministry of Environment did give 5 warnings to the MountPolley Imperial Metals prior to the spill, and also that the engineers that were responsible for the original construction of the dam also warned Imperial Metals MountPolley and pulled out of any responsibility regarding that dam. So these are really important to note. The province, the Ministry of Environment, and the Ministry of Energy and Mines attended likely meetings with the residents of Likely and the local Secwepemc people to answer questions, but the people at the town hall meetings were very upset that none of their questions were being answered, and it was like Joan said, they really don't know the answers because it's just such a big catastrophe of that size that they have no clue on how to fix it at a decent enough time or that the people want. Also, well, we have some questions here, but first of all, I'd like to, one of the questions is, how can we help? I live far away. I've been aware of the situation and very concerned about our brothers and sisters from the north. And I saw that question posted earlier. I know this lady, she's a part of the Native Youth Movement, resistance movement from down in so-called Puerto Rico, Taino territory, where they're dealing with a big, massive pipeline going through the island. They're dealing with America trying to make the whole island an industrial park. So there are many things that can do, and one of the things is always to put a lot of focus on the Indigenous people that are trying to stop industry within their own areas that they are living on, to be able to organize in small groups and families and communities, that small groups can do big things. And that's what we've shown and proved to ourselves during the Sacred Fire and the Secwepemc camp that we had set up to address this MountPolley spill. Another way that people can help is always to do fundraisers to support communities that are actually going back and taking back territories. There's and to support the work that needs to continue to be done. We have a fundraiser site. There's like some other people that are doing some testing. They have a fundraiser site. You can find those all online. We always in need of support for travel to get to different Indigenous communities, to be able to build alliances and such, and also to put pressure on Imperial Metals. Imperial Metals head office is in Vancouver, to put pressure on different provincial, like the Ministry of Energy and Mines, the Ministry of Environment, to put pressure on them, because they're really not doing their job right here, and they need to be put out in the open that they aren't fulfilling their responsibilities. One thing that was told to me by some respected elders is that as the salmon was gifted to us, was put here on the earth to provide us with food to keep us from starvation. And in turn, we were to uphold this responsibility as well. We are to return this responsibility and protect the salmon, defend the salmon, make sure that their birthing grounds were protected. And if we don't do that and uphold our responsibility and our original agreement with the salmon, that we won't have the salmon any longer to feed our people, to feed our mothers, to feed our babies. And this is like really important for all of us as Indigenous people, is that we have those original agreements to our foods and to our territories, and we need to uphold it by any means necessary and by any means that we can, and to our capacity, whatever that may be, we need to do that. And so, you know, just respect all of our salmon and our water and everything, that all of us here and everybody that's watching, that we are powerful, and we could collect even in prayer, to pray for our water, to pray for our land, and even for our collective decision making on how we're going to move forward, and make sure that this area gets cleaned up, so we could bring it back to as much as the clean state as we can. And there's no way that we can completely make it back to that same state, but we need to unite and stop all these other minings from happening. Rudat Creek, Red Chris, Imperial Metals, everywhere. So I have a question, and I think I'll pose it to Joan. There's a question, and it says, how long does it take for the contaminants to show up in the lower end of the food chain, and how long to work its way up the chain? So I don't know if you could answer that, Joan. But
I'm not a biologist. I can't answer it, but I could say that it will take quite a long time. Some of them will take longer than others, and it depends what people are eating and so on. But the testing they did right after the spill, for example, for selenium in the fish, it wouldn't have shown up at that point. It was too early. It takes a while for those things to manifest themselves. And if it's going to settle out in the turbidity is a problem as much as the contaminants. And so some of that will show very quickly because they can't, their gills clog up, right? So I'm not a biologist. That's a question that needs to be asked to somebody who understands, because maybe Jean knows actually.
Jean is on mute. I just well, after talking to the Japanese doctors and scientists that were studying the effects of the salmon or of the fish and the indigenous people eating the fish in the Grassy Narrows area on Anishinaabe territory, they've been studying that since the 70s, and they've been finding these contaminations. I think they said 60 cases of Minamota disease there, and this is from the mixing of mercury with other bacteria and stuff that create the toxic form that's goes into the fish and then goes into the mother and then passes on from the mother to the placenta to the baby. So these are long-term effects, and there's people. Alexandra Morton, she had came with the direction of the Statlium chiefs to go do some baseline testing of some of the salmon and the flesh samples of the salmon. So they have that, and there's many people putting together independent testing, different groups or individuals that have went and got sampling, and because they're not happy with the province, or they don't trust that the province is going to be giving the correct information or testing for the right chemicals and metals. So I have another question. Did they pay any environmental bonds or insurance? I know that they're not forced to pay for any insurance for a crisis or for a tailings disaster like that. And also the environmental bonds that they paid was for the fixing up the room. What is it called, Joan?
They have a closure bond of about 15 million at closure, which could probably be used in this instance. And then they say that they've raised 115 million to cover the breach through a share offering. But they also say in their financial statement in August that they're going to use 25 million of that for Red Chris and 36 million for the Northwest Transmission Line. So I'm not sure how much of that they're actually intending to use for the cleanup. I don't think they know what it's going to cost. And if past examples are any indication, the company will fight really hard to keep the costs down as low as they can. And it'll be up to everybody else to make sure that it's done properly.
Okay, there's another question. And what types of remediation options are available, and what is the time scale Imperial Metals has planned? How is it prepared to compensate the community for loss of livelihood and cultural impact? Well, I'll answer the last question of how is it prepared to compensate the community. When the province had put a ban on the water, Imperial Metals had stepped in to offer some clean water, which was at an area called Spanish Mountain Mine Camp, where they had water being hauled up to a old mine camp, where they were expecting likely residents to drive up this dangerous road with washboards and steep grade to get to a water where they were to haul their water from. And a lot of people from Likely said they didn't have no access to even get up there. Some of them are elderly. They don't have help to get this water. So a lot of them are forced to drink that water. And they're drinking that water and bathing in this water to this day. We have a town hall meeting with Ramsey Hart from MiningWatch Canada and Likely that's going to be coming up soon, tomorrow actually. And to answer some more questions that the Likely people and residents have, because they're not getting the answers they want from the province. I don't think there's any way that they could compensate for the loss of salmon and the contamination of salmon. Because this area is the spawning beds, all the salmon that swim up the Fraser River to get to these spawning beds, all the Indigenous nations all along the Fraser River and all along the way have no idea to tell if these are salmon from here or salmon from another spawning area. There's no way for them to tell. So how are the fishermen to have any type of faith, or they have so much fear? Like, I was in Lillooet just yesterday, talking to the fishermen, talking to the women in Lillooet, which is on the Fraser River, Stathley territory, after they felt how they felt when the MountPolley disaster happened, and they said they were scared. The first words they all said was fear. They have fear that their salmon are going to be contaminated. They didn't know whether they could fish now. They don't know if they could fish 10 years from now. And they cried because they said, what's going to happen to our tsuan, which is the traditional way that the people dry their salmon? What is going to happen to that? People eat salmon every day, and talking to scientists, they're saying that the human health risk assessments that they have for testing salmon take in consideration only as a settler or someone else would eat salmon, like possibly once a month or once every 4 months. So that when they put that model in there, they say, yeah, the salmon is all right to eat, but they never put into account how much salmon Indigenous people eat. And sometimes when you don't have no money and you can't go to the store as Indigenous people, you end up eating salmon twice a day, or even throughout the day you'll eat just salmon with other rice or in soup or something. So salmon is a really important part of who we are, all the way down into the ocean, all along the coast, and this is why people need to stand up. People need to recognize that this is important. There's an urgency. After we let the fire go out, and I brought that same urgency of the salmon and the plants and the area all around Yucna-Senchai-Metwa, all the urgency of the likely residents and the people and the children there that bathe in that water. I brought that urgency back to our community of Nisquamlet, and I felt like people were off in a different world. And you go into Vancouver and you see that people are off in a different world, or Toronto, or these different areas all around, and they're in a different world, and they don't see the devastation right in front of them. They can't touch it, they can't visualize it, so then it doesn't, at some point it feels like it's not important. But that's why we're here, is to bring that this is a sense of urgency, that we have to address this, because this is the precedent that they want to deal with all of our territories, straight from the Coast Salish territories, straight on to the Mi'kmaq territories, all the way to the Atlantic. That's how they want to deal with us as Indigenous people. They want to say that we don't care about you. We don't care about your salmon. We don't care about that you're Indigenous nations that have been here since the beginning of time. And that's what they're saying to us by not cleaning up this spill, by not addressing all the needs of the people of Likely. They're the Secwepemc people that depend on the salmon. So there's ways that we can organize. There's on our Yucna-Senchai-Metwa Facebook page to be able to come and unite and tell us your skills, and we'll put you to work. Like, there's lots of work to do. So again, I know I start going off. That's what I end up doing, but there's a question from the first type of the question: what types of remediation options are available to Joan or Jean or Joan? Getting mixed up. Joan, the remediation. Do you see that question on the slide?
Well, there's not. I mean, it's not rocket science what they need to do. I don't think they can. They won't be able to get the tailings out of Quesnel Lake. Dredging a lake that deep and so on would cause more problems. They're going to count on them settling. You could conceivably dredge Hazeltine Creek and put the sediments. You could even do dry stacking of the sediments somewhere else, or put them back in the tailings impoundment. They do talk about, they've been putting the water back in Springer Pit. The one thing that's a little glimmer of hope in terms of their ability to clean this up over time if they put the money in it is that most of those tailings are not acid generating. So they're they're not highly alkaline either. So that means that there are metals that are leaching, but not enough had spilled. A lot of other mines have, like Mount Washington. There was a lot of damage to the salmon streams in Mount Washington over years because the mine and the tailings were acid generated. So there's that is a bit of a glimmer here. I probably could be cleaned up if they put a lot of money in it, but it'll be generations before anything will come back to what it was. There's problems because of all the vegetation that's been washed down the stream. There's destruction of the environment around, and the salmon beds in Hazeltine Creek and around parts of Lake Quesnel are damaged probably for generations. So in terms of cleaning it up, I mean, they've got two options, basically dredging and covering it up. Now they're talking about spreading grass seed on Hazeltine Creek to prevent more of it washing down if there's a big rain. Grass doesn't take root that quickly, so it's kind of hard to know when winter's coming on.
Okay, thank you. There's been attention brought to at some of the likely meetings that they were taking in human waste, medical waste, and solid waste from the Greater Vancouver area, and they were bringing it onto the MountPolley site and dumping it. And we thought it was in the pit, one of the pits, but then no, it was confirmed by some of the workers that it was actually going into the dam, into the impoundments area. And so that's one of the concerns, and people were wondering, did that all get flushed in the water too, all that medical waste and all that human waste that they were dumping in the dam? Were they getting... And so that was some type of crazy thing, and that we need to expose as well.
That's fairly common practice, actually, to put other kinds of waste in tailings impoundments. So if that's there, yeah, it may have, depending on where it was in the tailings impoundment, it might have washed out, yeah.
There's this is from the event page, and one of the questions is, what should be of greater concern to the general public, the fact that there is no substantial cleanup, or that industry, in this case Imperial Metals, is allowed through weak legislation to write their own rules for contractors? Why? So.
I don't know that one of them is worse than the other. They're related. It's about regulatory capture and the inability of the people to control what the government does. Without a power struggle between the industry determining what regulations look like and how much money they put into cleanup. It's too early to say there's no substantial cleanup yet. They could still be forced into having to do a substantial cleanup. And some of the industry will want them to do that too, because it's a poster child for what's wrong with the industry. And so some of the industry and the government will want to get it cleaned up, so people will say, yeah, look, it can be cleaned. So there's a possibility it could be, but it'll take a long time, and parts of it can't be. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Yesterday or the other day, I was having a conversation with Joan about the development of this independent panel of experts, and she was given her expertise on forming one of these independent panel of experts, and mentioning too that if we come up with $1 million to do testing, then they're going to come up with $2 million. That there's always a way that they could find us, that they'll be more credible than anything that I was really concerned about how we're going to get the proper information to the people, and we've been putting calls out to scientists and toxicologists and marine biologists and all these different sciences with different skills to come on board, and I think we said that we would call it a Secwepemc Oversight Committee of the MountPolley disaster, where people could actually look at what the province is doing with their testing, look at and investigate their tests, and show where they're not possibly testing for certain things and everything. I wanted to see, if, Joan, if you could talk a little bit about that.
My experience with the kind of risk assessments and testing that are going to go on is that it's going to really be important for the First Nations who are most affected to be on top of that testing is and where it's happening. But doing testing on the scale that's going to be required is really, really expensive. It means a lot of different metals being tested in every sample. It means a lot of samples over time. And so having independent scientists from the First Nations that are affected taking a look at what the data is that they're coming up with and demanding more data and helping with look at the analysis of the data. But as important as getting the data yourself. The real problem is that when they get all that data, they put it in a risk analysis, the kind of matrix, and what factors go into that matrix and how you judge them. There's hundreds of different variables in that matrix. Makes a huge difference to how it turns out. And I looked at 9 really serious contaminated sites where there was perpetual care, for example, last year as part of the Giant Mine remediation environmental assessment 2 years ago. And one of the things that struck me was that in every single case, although people said they got sick, there was horrible chemical spewed around, the risk assessment showed in every case that there was no traceable relationship between the people getting sick and the chemicals that were in this toxic site. And so it's the people working on the risk analysis and doing that kind of work that need to be really monitored and watched. And I think there's been some steps to do that, but the more oversight, the better. And the different people who are affected need to make sure that they have access to that information, access to the kind of technical assistance they need to make it work.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was exactly what I understood from that, is that they never consider Indigenous diet and the amounts of food that we live off of from the land still. We have a question. This is from YouTube. Someone made a comment. They had a permit to dump their own employees' waste as well, not treated. At this time, the E. coli is high and no one has been warned by Ministry of Environment or Health Authority that residents should not be drinking the water. Steve Robertson with the MOE is saying this has nothing to do with the breach. So those are some concerns. I know I've heard that at the Likely meetings and from Likely residents as well. There is high E. coli in the lake water there, the water that they tested. What are some most important actions to support your efforts that people can initiate or participate in? There's the communities that are opposing to the current day Imperial Metals sites, the Red Chris up at the Tahltan territory, and also the Rudok Creek mine in the headwaters of the Adams in the lower or the southern part of the Secwepemc territory, are taking action against these mines. They do not want to see these mines happening. They're in need of support, mainly financial support right now. And also, we are going to be putting together this oversight committee to be looking at overseeing the testing and stuff that the province is doing, and doing some of our own testing on the sediment and such that we feel that they're not taking enough tests of, or not doing the proper testing. So there's like a fundraiser site, and on the internet, I'll post it on the YouTube page after. We'll be able to post some stuff on the fundraiser sites. Okay. Just wanted to see if there was anything else that Jean, that you would like to mention or say that you might have missed. If someone could unmute her. Could somebody unmute her? Oh, Jean
wanted to mention too that the Secwepemc people in this area, our elders, our Secwepemc and all our ancestors, when he told stories, he took great pride in telling us about the ecosystem up in that area. And he always talked about how it was, when they visited that area, that it was always much the same as it has been for a long time. Much of the time it was unspoiled. I also forgot to mention that in the Canal Lake area, in the Secwepemc and the Secwepemc that there are ancient forests in the unspoiled wilderness areas. I have a picture of my son and a friend who, around one of these huge trees, in there, one of these ancient trees, that would take maybe about 10 people that could go around it. And that was the size of those ancient forests, rainforest trees. I also wanted to mention too, and I think I forgot to mention that, is that we have the world famous Horsefly River salmon run. And that also flows right into the Canal Lake River, or the, yeah. And there's some interesting other primary flows, primary rivers that flow in there, along with the Horsefly River. It's also the Mitchell River, and it's the up in the on the north arm, it's called. And into this Mitchell River also there's a Niagara that flows somehow into Canal Lake. I, with other Secwepemc elders, took a boat trip up there into the Canal River, and it was so crystal clear. You could see the salmon, you could see the bottom of this river, and you could just drink the water from there. Just want to go back and talk a little bit again about the salmon. You know, the loss of the salmon for us as Secwepemc is a matter of life or death of our culture. Just have a question: can our salmon survive this devastation? Thank you.
That's the question that we're all asking as Indigenous peoples, because we've never had mining like this before. Our ancestors never had to deal with this, and then now here in 2014 we're dealing with this, and it's like a emotional hardship. It's like psychological warfare on our people, and it's life or death. That's what it is. It's life or death. I have a question here. It's for you, Jean. Someone had sent it. It says, what guidance do Secwepemc traditions and stories give us for responding to the disaster on an ongoing basis?
I think we need to go back to our ceremonies. I was really happy when I heard that there was the sacred fire. Our spirituality, our Secwepemc spirituality is intact, and it's very strong. We just need to go back to a lot of our own beliefs and how we strengthen ourselves in coping with so much of these destructive ways and the ways that are not ours, that we need to connect back with our spirituality and make sure that we ask the Creator that gave us this territory of ours, to protect it and to always use our valuable beliefs from the stories that our ancestors have given us. I talked a bit about the protocol that we have. The protocol, we must pass that on to our young people, and not to be afraid to tell them about how our people looked after the land, and how to them that the mountains were sacred. Secwepemc is a very sacred mountain. There's a legend that when we listen to that story, it gives us our protocol. It tells us how we have to protect ourselves. This way we don't have any harm bestowed on us. It makes us even more, it more or less cleanses our ways. It's our spirituality, and it deepens that spirituality of ours. Juk.
We have another question here. It says, for people who rely on the land for their daily food, how will they safely feed their families for the winter? I ask as this is the time of the year that I begin hunting for my children, and what will these families eat all winter? And when the generations to follow to switch over to grocery store food will make people sick, as will the contaminated animals and fish. So I guess I could talk a little bit about that, and that talking to different aquatic people, biologists, they were saying that it might not make its way into the food chain this year, and that's why people were continuing to fish salmon this year. But I've heard from a lot of people that fished this year said, I think this might be our last year. And it's so sad. It's so sad to hear people saying that. I was talking to a group of elders at the Shuswap gathering who was saying, we get so used to putting food away every year. Salmon away. Every year we put it away. We know, we start packing up for camp. It's in our blood. We know what to do. And what are we going to do now? And I really believe that what needs to happen is that we do really need a call for this mining moratorium. Secwepemc chiefs and other leadership across this so-called province of BC have been calling on a mining moratorium, and that we really can't have anything like this happen. This is the last one, and the last and the only one that we can afford to have within our territory. We cannot afford any more water to be contaminated, any more salmon-bearing creeks and spawning beds to be contaminated. It really has to be a joint collective effort amongst all Indigenous people, residents, settlers, to all unite to keep our water clean, because we're doing this not just for us as Indigenous people, but everybody that depends on this land for their livelihood. We need clean water in order to survive. That water flows in our blood, that we are water. We are water. We had an altar at the fire, at the sacred fire, and someone had come with this water, this jar of water that was a mixture of maybe 30 to 50 different waters from around the world. And he brought that water and he said, if this water can mix, so can we. We could all mix and we could all become one strong force to defend this, our sacredness, and this, like, or else we'll have this. This is the water that they want us, filled with toxic sediment and sludge. Like, this is what they want us to drink. This is what they want our bodies to be like, because it'll go right into our blood, into who we are. And what they want, after going and surveying their damage and being up there for 2 weeks and actually slipping and getting sucked into that toxic sludge on Hazeltine Creek, I realized they want us all to be toxic. not just this land, not just Hazeltine Creek, not just Yuknasen-Kaimetwa, every single one of us, they want us to be toxic. And we need to all stand up. We need to do whatever we can to stop mining, stop industry from coming in and attacking our way of life. We have from the IdleNoMore website, it just says that the Native Americans in the States are getting COBEL settlement checks this week. Is there a way to work cooperatively with nations down here to ask people to donate some of what they receive to the Red Chris Mine Action and the Oversight Committee? So yes, of course, there always needs to be funds, and this would be something great to put money towards, is to stopping Red Chris Mine. That's the main thing, is like really stopping Red Chris from going through right now. They're saying that they're depending on the Red Chris Mine in order to, they've said this publicly at the likely meetings. So they're saying it publicly that they need that Red Chris Mine open so they can afford cleanup. And but according to Joan, that's a lie. There's a way to donate. You could donate either through Imperial No More at gmail.com with the email transfer. You could go to a fundraiser site. We'll be posting it on the YouTube link later. And we're coming up to 6:21. We said this was going to go to 6:30. We have on the events page, we have two. How is the legal case and / analysis proceeding? So right now there is no legal case, and there are some law firms that are willing to come and do workshops with the community of Likely and surrounding area on some of the legal options that people have. So that's just being in the works right now. Just like to say that it is 44 days since the disaster happened. A lot of that time was grieving, a lot of the time was shock, and now people are finally, residents and Secwepemc people are finally able to start think clearly on what this really means and the enormity of this disaster on our way of life. Why is the Canadian government subsidizing this industry with negative tax rates, with huge cleanup bills, with unfettered access to resources that belong to First Nations and other Canadians, with our children's future and the future of Mother Earth herself? Why and how can we expose this outrage to the general public? So, Joan, do you want to sort of explain about this subsidizing this industry with the negative tax rates?
Well, it goes to the very heart of how colonial Canada was established. I mean, we were set up by Europeans who came here to pillage and plunder the resources that they found on Turtle Island. Eh? So it's part of the history of this country that people, all the sort of hierarchical arrangements, all the ways in which our business and industry is structured is around that pillage of resources, whether it's the cod or the forests or mining or water, that they're treated as commodities that are to be turned into dollars and shipped wherever. And people get sucked into supporting it. People end up supporting it because they need to support their kids. They need to they're starving and they want to find, they came from countries where they were starving sometimes, and they don't want to be starving, so they'll take the only jobs that are around. And if you look at places like Sudbury, which is 125 years of mining, people were brought from all over the world, and there were a number of Anishinaabe people who ended up working there too. And as the land was taken from people and destroyed from the Anishinaabe, they ended up having to work at the mine and have contracts with the mine, and they didn't question it because they were afraid that they wouldn't have a job. And so some people got very, very rich off those mines in Sudbury and in other places, and they liked continuing to get rich. But a lot of people are just supporting their families, and they'll defend the companies they work for because they're afraid, and they don't see an alternative. And the alternative is around a very different way of organizing the way we take care of ourselves. And there's wonderful models from traditional Secwepemc and other ways of living on the land. And there's also models from sort of the alternative economy, from food cooperatives and organic farming, and there's even in the Williams Lake area, there's all sorts of other ways to live on the land that don't require destroying it, and in fact heal it and take care of it. And it's a power struggle. It's a power struggle between the people who want to live that way and who support what Indigenous peoples are asking for and have had in this country, and the people who still want to pillage and plunder and feel trapped by that paradigm. That's about the best I can do in the time we've got.
Okay, thank you. We lost Jean, and she's trying to get back on before we can close, but she's just having some difficulty right now. We have another question. It was just like, what more can people do? Is the moratorium enough? Is it enough to protest? And so I really believe that they really want to open up this province of so-called BC to investors. They want to open this up to the world. They want to strip the last of the remaining resources off of our Indigenous territories, from beneath it, the water, everything. And they want to do this with pipelines. They want to do this with fish farms. They want to do it by any means and make their millions and billions and leave. But for us as Indigenous people, we have nowhere else to go. This is our territory. People could move to Hawaii, people could move to Europe, people could move other places. But for us, this is our territory, and we're here to stay. And this is why it's so important for us. That's why it was so important for us to have Jean Williams, Secwepemc Elder, our Kia, here to give and shed light on the importance behind our territory, that we have ancient links and ancestral ties and inherent responsibilities to these territories. We have jurisdiction. We have to our territories. We have all of these things that has always been in place for us to look after these territories and for us to assert our rights and our responsibilities, and that we can actually be here on our land. We can live here, we can hunt here, we could fish here, we could raise our children here till the end of time, just like we have from the beginning of time. We've been here. And like Tecumseh traveled the great lands, uniting nations throughout, uniting warriors to defend the lands. And that's how I believe that we are, and we continue to spread that spirit and have Tecumseh here with us, just like all of our other great leaders throughout Secwepemc territory, all the way from Alaska to the tip of Argentina. We come from mighty Indigenous nations, and through uniting is the way that we were going to win, by showing that Indigenous people are standing up to deter investors from coming into our homelands and thinking that they could get away, pillage and plunder and get away with it, not following their own laws that they create for themselves, because here in our territory we have Secwepemc laws, and they're more ancient than any Canadian or provincial law, and this is what we are upholding, and this is what will continue to push as the younger generation coming up, is that we're not going to tolerate for anything less. People may say that it's naive for us to think this way, but it is not. When we hold that spirit in our heart, and we believe in our ancestors, and we believe in our spirituality, and we have this water here and this candle, and we have our medicine burning, like that's our power. And so it's like 1 minute to go. I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us here, and that there is like many other questions. We'll get to them and answer them in the proper way as we can. So I would just like to say thank you to IdleNoMore and Defenders of the Land for helping host this webinar, and also for Joan Kuyek and for Jean for coming and bringing your expertise to this webinar, and for the volunteers that are all behind the scenes, all the technicians and things that made this possible. So Kuksha, and thank you.